Imagine trying to be romantic while your entire family, including grandma, is lying 3 feet away, fully awake, pretending not to hear anything. Or picture having to keep all your clothes on during intimacy because showing skin was considered a mortal sin. Welcome to the absolutely bizarre world of sex in ancient times, where privacy didn't exist, bathing was optional, and the rules were stranger than fiction. Today, we're diving into the most awkward, hilarious, and downright insane ways our ancestors managed their love lives. And trust me, after hearing about ancient Rome's public fertility festivals, you'll never complain about modern dating again. Let's start with colonial America, where young couples faced a dilemma. They needed to court each other, but privacy, that was basically witchcraft. Enter the bundling board, possibly the most awkward invention in romantic history. Picture this. You're a young man in 1750s Pennsylvania. You finally get permission to spend time with your sweetheart. But there's a catch. You both have to lie in the same bed, fully clothed, with a wooden board dividing you down the middle like some kind of intimate Berlin Wall. Oh, and sometimes, just to be extra sure nothing happened, the girl would be sewn into a sack up to her armpits. Yes, sewn into a sack. The parents would be in the same room, casually knitting or reading the Bible, while you tried to have a romantic conversation through a plank of wood. Some families even tied the boy's ankles together or put him in a special courting bag that was basically a sleeping bag from hell. But here's the kicker. This system had about a 30% failure rate. Turns out, horny teenagers in the 1700s were just as creative as they are today. Who would have thought? The bundling tradition actually came from practical needs in colonial times. Houses were freezing cold and fuel was expensive. Families couldn't afford to heat multiple rooms, so courting couples would share body heat under heavy quilts, with that blessed board between them, of course. Some historians found records of boards that were suspiciously worn down in certain spots, suggesting that young lovers found ways to at least hold hands through convenient imperfections in the wood. In Wales, they had an even stranger version called Caru Yny Gwely, or loving in bed. The boy would climb through the girl's window at night with full parental permission and spend the night talking to her while she remained wrapped up like a human burrito. If he could climb in quietly enough and prove his good intentions by keeping his hands to himself all night, he was considered worthy husband material. One Welsh diarist from 1798 wrote that his future father-in-law actually helped him with the latter, then stood below the window shouting helpful advice like, "Remember, boy, no touching, but do compliment her needlework." The Dutch in New York took bundling to another level of awkwardness with the queesting tradition. Not only was there a board, but the girl's mother would literally sit at the foot of the bed, knitting, and occasionally clearing her throat loudly if she heard too much giggling. One Dutch immigrant wrote home to Amsterdam in 1680 saying, "The customs here are most peculiar. I spent 6 hours discussing cheese-making with my beloved Greta while her mother sat watching us like a hawk guards its eggs. My legs were bound with rope, and Greta was wrapped in so many blankets she resembled a large sausage." Romance in the New World is quite different from what we knew. If you think bundling boards were weird, buckle up for ancient Rome, where subtlety was apparently illegal. Every March, Romans celebrated Lupercalia, a fertility festival that makes modern Vegas look like a church picnic. Picture this insanity. Young men would strip naked, sacrifice a goat, then make whips from the goat's skin. Still naked, they'd run through the streets, whipping any woman who wanted to get pregnant that year. And women lined up for this. They'd literally hold out their hands to get whipped by naked dudes covered in sacrificial goat blood because they believed it would make them fertile. But wait, it gets better. Roman wedding nights were a public affair. The bride would be escorted to the bedroom by a parade of wedding guests singing obscene songs. And I mean obscene. We have surviving lyrics that would make a sailor blush. The guests would stand outside the bedroom door, banging pots and pans, shouting advice and dirty jokes while the couple tried to consummate. One Roman writer, Catullus, wrote a wedding song that included the line, "Boy, give nuts to the children. Your days of playing with nuts are over. Now you must play with something else." This was considered appropriate wedding music. The Romans also had a charming tradition called feminine verses, essentially ancient rap battles about genitals that were performed at weddings. Professional poets would be hired to create the most creatively obscene rhymes about the bride and groom's upcoming activities. The raunchier the verses, the better the marriage was supposed to be. We have surviving examples that include detailed descriptions of what the groom should do with various vegetables. I'm not making this up. There's an entire verse about turnips that archaeologists still blush when translating. During the festival of Floralia, dedicated to the goddess Flora, prostitutes would perform naked in the theater, and the audience would throw lupins and beans at them, which supposedly increased everyone's fertility. Regular citizens would wear flower crowns and nothing else, dancing through the streets in what one Christian writer later described as a most shameful display of human rutting that would make dogs blush. The festival lasted 6 days, and by the end, the entire city of Rome basically turned into one giant flower-covered orgy. Augustus Caesar once tried to tone it down, but the people nearly rioted, so he gave up and just moved his mother out of the city for the week. But perhaps the most insane Roman bedroom custom was the pronuba tradition. This was an older married woman who would literally guide the bride's hand to touch the groom's genitals for the first time, in front of witnesses, to ensure she knew what she was dealing with. The pronuba would then give detailed instructions about what to do next, sometimes with helpful hand gestures, and occasionally with carved wooden visual aids. One Roman bride, Julia Felix, left graffiti in Pompeii, complaining that her pronuba brought a disturbingly realistic wooden model and spent 2 hours explaining techniques while her new husband stood there turning various shades of purple. Now let's talk about the Middle Ages, where the Catholic Church had very specific opinions about bedroom activities. Enter the chemise cagoule, possibly the least sexy garment ever invented. This was essentially a massive nightgown with a strategically placed hole. Just a hole. That's it. Couples would wear these tent-like garments that covered everything except the absolute minimum necessary for procreation. The church actually recommended this because they believed that seeing your spouse naked would lead to excessive lust, which was a sin even within marriage. But here's where it gets absolutely bonkers. The church had an official calendar of when you could and couldn't be intimate. Not on Sundays, the Lord's Day. Not on Wednesdays or Fridays, fasting days. Not during Lent, 40 days. Not during Advent, 4 weeks. Not during Pentecost. Not on feast days. Not when the woman was menstruating, pregnant, or nursing. Do the math. That left about 44 days a year when it was technically okay. And even then, you had to do it in the dark, in the missionary position only, without enjoying it too much. One priest actually suggested couples should recite prayers during the act to avoid sinful pleasure. Medieval penitentials, basically sin price lists, had incredibly specific punishments for every possible bedroom variation. If you had relations while the woman was on top, 3 years of fasting on bread and water. From behind, also 3 years. Standing up, 7 years because apparently gravity offended God. One medieval monk, Brother Gerald, spent his entire life creating a 200-page manual detailing every possible position and its corresponding punishment. The manuscript still exists in the Vatican secret archives, and scholars who've read it say it's accidentally the most comprehensive medieval sex manual ever written. The church was so obsessed with bedroom regulation that they created special furniture to prevent sin. The procreation bed had a board with a hole that could be locked in place, ensuring couples could only engage in the approved position. Some monasteries actually manufactured these beds as a source of income. There's a surviving receipt from 1287 where the Abbey of Cluny sold 47 virtue preservation beds to the Duke of Burgundy for his daughter's dowries. The beds came with instruction manuals written in Latin that explained how to use them while maintaining proper Christian modesty. But the absolute peak of medieval bedroom insanity was the practice of holy supervision. Some extremely devout couples would invite a priest to sit in their bedroom and read scripture aloud during intimacy to ensure they didn't enjoy it too much. Saint Francesca of Rome allegedly had her confessor sit behind a screen in her bedroom for the first year of marriage, coughing loudly if he suspected excessive enthusiasm. Her husband Lorenzo later wrote in his diary that the experience was most effective in suppressing carnal desires, as nothing diminishes ardor quite like Father Antonio reading Leviticus in his nasal voice, while one attempts to produce an air. Speaking of weird bedroom rules, let's visit ancient Egypt, where things get genuinely bizarre. Egyptians associated lettuce, yes, lettuce, with sexual prowess. Why? Because when you break a lettuce stem, it releases a milky substance, and ancient Egyptians thought, well, you can imagine. The god Min, deity of fertility, was always depicted with a massive erection and surrounded by lettuce plants. Pharaohs would publicly eat entire heads of lettuce before visiting their wives to demonstrate their virility. But the real insanity was Egyptian birth control. One method involved crocodile dung. Yes, women would create a pessary, basically an ancient diaphragm, made of crocodile feces mixed with honey. The idea was that the alkaline nature of the dung would kill sperm. Spoiler alert, it didn't work, and probably led to some very unfortunate infections. Even weirder, Egyptian men sometimes used a linen condom, soaked in onion juice, because nothing says romance like the aroma of onions and the constant fear of crocodiles. The Egyptians took their fertility rituals to absolutely bonkers levels. During the festival of Min, the pharaoh would publicly masturbate into the Nile River to ensure the annual flood would be fertile. This wasn't some symbolic gesture. The pharaoh would literally stand on a platform in front of thousands of people and ensure the prosperity of Egypt. The crowd would cheer and throw lettuce leaves. Pharaoh Ramesses II apparently performed this ritual over 60 times during his reign and had priests measure his output to predict the harvest. One papyrus records that in his 47th year, the measurement was disappointing, and they had to import grain from Nubia. Egyptian nobility had conception rooms painted with explicit scenes designed to inspire fertility. But here's the insane part. They believed the images you looked at during conception would influence your child's appearance. One noble couple spent their wedding night in a room covered with images of the god Thoth, hoping for an intelligent child. When the baby was born with a large nose, they blamed it on accidentally glancing at an ibis painting at the crucial moment. Archaeologists have found conception rooms with everything from acrobatic positions to scenes involving sacred crocodiles, though hopefully those were just for spiritual inspiration. The ancient Egyptians also believed that certain positions could determine a baby's gender. Lying on your right side would produce a boy, left side for a girl. Standing up meant twins. One medical papyrus, the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, recommends that if you want a boy, the woman should drink a mixture of honey, dates, and the dried penis of a bull ground into powder. For a girl, she should consume mouse droppings mixed with beer. The same text helpfully notes that if she vomits after drinking either mixture, she's already pregnant. No kidding. Drinking mouse poop beer would make anyone vomit. Ancient Greece gave us democracy, philosophy, and some truly bizarre bedroom customs. Let's start with the wedding night ritual in Sparta. Spartan brides would have their heads completely shaved and would be dressed in men's clothing and sandals. They'd then lie alone in a dark room waiting for their husband, who would sneak in like a thief, quickly do the deed, and then immediately return to the barracks to sleep with his fellow soldiers. This could go on for years. Some couples had multiple children before the husband ever saw his wife in daylight or women's clothing, but here's the absolutely insane part. In Athens, the gymnasiums where men exercised naked, yes, completely naked, covered in olive oil, were also social clubs. Men would discuss philosophy, politics, and often engage in romantic relationships, all while their wives stayed home, often in relationships with each other since they rarely saw their husbands. The Greeks even had a specific position called intercrural sex, between the thighs, which was considered more socially acceptable than other forms because it avoided certain taboos. They had diagrams of this on pottery that survived to this day. Imagine being an archaeologist and discovering that your big find is essentially ancient Greek instructional pornography. The Spartans had an even weirder practice called wife sharing, or polykoidia. If an older man had a young wife, he was expected to invite a younger, stronger man to sleep with her to produce better offspring. The old husband would literally interview candidates like it was a job application. So, tell me about your battlefield experience and your family's history of tall children. One Spartan king, Ariston, actually borrowed his best friend's wife because she was the most beautiful woman in Sparta. When she had a baby, both men claimed paternity, and they settled it with a wrestling match. The friend won, but they continued sharing her anyway because, as Ariston put it, Sparta needs strong children more than I need exclusive bedroom rights. Greek symposiums, those famous philosophical drinking parties, had a post-dinner tradition called the komos, where guests would parade naked through the streets to the house of whoever they wanted to seduce. They'd sing obscene songs and perform athletic feats to prove their worthiness. One Athenian writer describes a komos where 14 naked philosophers showed up at his door at 2 a.m., doing handstands and reciting erotic poetry about figs. His wife allegedly poured a chamber pot on them from the window, which was considered a polite way of saying not interested. But the most bizarre Greek practice was the Athenian Adonia festival, where women would climb onto their rooftops and create Adonis gardens, quick-growing plants in broken pots that would sprout and die within days, symbolizing the brief life of Adonis. During this festival, women would openly mourn, tear their clothes, and then engage in ritual orgies on the rooftops while their husbands were locked out of the house. Men would gather in the streets below, playing music and trying to catch glimpses. One Athenian husband wrote a bitter complaint to the city council that his wife threw clay pots at him when he tried to climb up. And the neighbor women cheered her on while doing unspeakable things with vegetables. The council's response was basically, "It's once a year, deal with it." Now, here's a problem that affected 90% of humanity for most of history: the one-room house. Whether you were a medieval peasant, a colonial farmer, or an ancient Roman pleb, your entire family lived in one room. This meant that intimacy happened while your children slept inches away, your in-laws were right there, and sometimes even the farm animals were in the corner. Medieval peasants developed a complex system of coughs, snores, and turned-backs to signal, "We're not listening." Children were taught from an early age to pretend to be asleep when the bed started creaking. One historian found a diary from 1652 where a man complained that his mother-in-law would provide helpful commentary during intimate moments with his wife. In ancient Rome's insulae apartment buildings, the walls were so thin that everyone knew everyone else's business. Juvenal, a Roman poet, wrote about hearing his upstairs neighbors so clearly that he could tell you exactly what positions they favored. Some cultures developed sex furniture specifically for this problem. The Chinese had the love chair, essentially a chair with very quiet joints that wouldn't wake the family. Vikings had special marriage beds with thick curtains, creating a tiny private room within the room. The situation was so universal that different cultures developed elaborate etiquette around ignoring what you heard. In medieval France, there was a saying, "The straw has no ears," meaning that everyone in the shared sleeping area would pretend the straw mattresses made them deaf to nighttime activities. One French peasant's diary from 1389 describes how his family of 12 all slept in the same room, and when his eldest son got married, they hung a single cloth between the newlyweds' corner and the rest of the family. The diarist notes, "We sang loudly during dinner for the first month to give them courage." Japanese families in the Edo period had perhaps the most elegant solution, the yobai system. Young men would silently sneak into houses at night and slip into bed with unmarried daughters, with the full knowledge of the parents who would pretend to be asleep. If the daughter accepted him, she'd let him stay. If not, she'd pinch him, and he'd leave just as silently. The parents would judge the man's suitability by how quietly he could navigate their house in the dark. One father wrote that he deliberately left pottery near his daughter's futon to test suitors' stealth. If they break nothing, they may be worthy. Young Taro destroyed 3 vases and stepped on the cat. He is not welcome back. But perhaps the most creative solution came from medieval Ireland, where they invented bundling bags with bells. These were special sleeping bags for unmarried couples that had small bells sewn all around them. Any excessive movement would create a racket that would wake the entire household. One Irish chronicle mentions a particularly determined couple who learned to move so slowly that they could be intimate without ringing a single bell, a process that apparently took 4 hours. The girl's father was so impressed by the young man's patience and determination that he immediately approved the marriage, saying, "Any lad with that much self-control will make a fine husband. Here's something that'll make you grateful for modern privacy. Witness requirements for consummation." In medieval Europe, particularly among nobility, consummation had to be verified. This meant that witnesses, usually high-ranking nobles or clergy, would either stand behind a curtain listening, check the bed sheets afterward, or, and this is the worst, actually watch. When Prince Arthur married Catherine of Aragon in 1501, 7 witnesses stood in the bedroom to confirm consummation. The prince, who was 15, reportedly emerged and loudly declared, "Bring me a cup of ale, for I have been this night in the midst of Spain." Spoiler: historians think he was lying. In France, it was even worse. The entire court would escort the couple to bed, check that they were both naked, then draw the curtains and wait outside. They'd return in the morning to inspect the sheets for evidence. Marie Antoinette had to endure this with dozens of French nobles essentially grading her wedding night performance. The witness tradition reached peak insanity with the marriage of Margaret of Burgundy to Louis the Fext of France in 1305. Not only did 12 nobles watch the consummation, but they had a scoring system. They rated the groom's performance on vigor, duration, and probable success of conception. The scores were recorded in the official court records. Louis apparently scored poorly in duration, but made up for it in vigor, earning a satisfactory with room for improvement rating. The document still exists in the French National Archives, complete with helpful suggestions from the Duke of Orleans about pacing. In some cases, when the groom was too young or too nervous to perform, they had professional assistants who would provide instruction or even demonstration. When Charles II of Spain married Marie-Louise of Orléans, he was so sickly and inexperienced that the court physician had to use puppets to explain the process. When that didn't work, they brought in a couple of palace servants to demonstrate behind a semi-transparent screen. The poor king was so traumatized that he didn't attempt consummation for another 3 months, and when he finally did, 14 courtiers were present to cheer him on. One witness wrote, "His Majesty required considerable encouragement and 2 glasses of fortified wine." The Byzantine Empire took things to another level with the virginity trial before royal weddings. The bride would be examined by a panel of elderly women to confirm her virginity. Then immediately after the wedding night, the same panel would examine her again to confirm consummation had occurred. They had a whole checklist of physical signs they looked for, which they'd announce publicly to the court. One Byzantine princess, Theodora, apparently failed the second examination, leading to a 3-day theological debate about whether vigorous horseback riding could produce similar physical effects. The panel eventually decided that she had definitely been riding something, and the marriage was declared valid. Before we wrap up, let's talk about ancient birth control, which ranged from ineffective to actively dangerous. Romans believed that wearing a cat's liver in a tube on your left foot would prevent pregnancy. Ancient Greeks thought sneezing after sex would work. It doesn't. But the absolute wildest method comes from medieval Europe. Weasel testicles. Women would wear dried weasel testicles around their neck or thigh as contraception. The book, The Trotula, a medieval medical text, recommended this along with wearing a donkey's hoof or a child's tooth. One method involved a woman spitting 3 times into a frog's mouth after intercourse. But perhaps the most tragic was the use of mercury in ancient China. Women would drink liquid mercury, which did prevent pregnancy, by slowly poisoning them to death. The ancient world had some absolutely bonkers theories about how conception worked, which led to even more insane contraception methods. Aristotle believed that women were just incubators for male seed, so Greek women would try to make themselves inhospitable by eating hot foods and taking scalding baths. One Greek physician recommended jumping backwards 7 times after intercourse while sneezing and shouting, "Not today!" He claimed a 60% success rate, though his sample size was suspicious since it was just his wife, who was probably already infertile from all the jumping. Medieval Europeans believed that conception required simultaneous orgasm, so one contraception method was simply ensuring the woman didn't enjoy herself, which, given medieval bedroom practices, probably wasn't that difficult. Some women would wear amulets made from a mule's earwax mixed with mare's urine, which they believed would make them temporarily sterile. The smell alone probably worked as contraception by keeping everyone at least 10 feet away. But the Romans win the prize for most disgusting method with their use of gladiator blood. Women would drink the blood of defeated gladiators, believing that the warrior essence would fight off any incoming sperm like tiny soldiers. Some entrepreneurial gladiators started selling their blood as premium contraception, claiming that blood from victories was more effective than blood from defeats. One Roman merchant's wife reportedly spent a fortune on championship blood from a gladiator who'd won 20 fights, only to get pregnant anyway. She sued the gladiator for false advertising, and the case went all the way to the Roman Senate, who ruled that blood efficacy could not be legally guaranteed. So there you have it, the absolutely insane world of ancient intimacy, where privacy was a myth, lettuce was an aphrodisiac, and your mother-in-law might be offering tips from 3 feet away. The next time you're frustrated with modern dating, just remember, at least you don't have to wear a giant nightgown with a hole in it, get whipped by naked men covered in goat blood, or have your wedding night graded by a panel of nobles. Our ancestors managed to keep humanity going despite bundling boards, one-room houses, and the constant presence of disapproving relatives. If they could figure out romance under those conditions, maybe there's hope for all of us. No crocodile dung required. What's the weirdest historical bedroom fact you've ever heard? Let me know in the comments below, if you can type through the secondhand embarrassment. And if you enjoyed this dive into history's most awkward moments, make sure to subscribe for more insane historical facts that your teachers definitely didn't tell you about. Next week, we're exploring the absolutely revolting beauty standards of ancient times, including why Romans used gladiator sweat as perfume. Yes, really. Until then, remember, no matter how awkward your love life might be, at least you don't need congressional witnesses.